I'd like to get Mr. Thakkar to come up to throw light on craft in education. He has a bachelor's degree in interior design from the School of Interior Design, CEPT University, master's degree in visual communication from the Birmingham Institute of Art and Design, UK. Thakkar is an associate professor and program chair, interior design at the Faculty of Design, director at Design Innovation and Craft Resource Center, DICRC at CEPT University, Ahmedabad. He has worked on various design, craft and research projects in India, Europe and Australia. Notable publications co-authored by him are Sahaj, Vernacular Furniture of Gujarat, to be published in 2018, co-authored with Mitraja Baes, Samruddha Dikshit and Ben Cartwright. Pratha, Kath Khuni Architecture of Himachal Pradesh, 2013. Matra, Ways of Measuring Vernacular Built Forms of Himachal Pradesh. And he has authored Naksh, The Art of Wood Carving of Traditional Houses of Gujarat, Focus on Ornamentation in 2004. He is also a recipient of several awards from Charles Walls India Trust and the SDMC Award Research Fellowship. He has received gold medals from CEPT University and the Gujarat Institute for Civil Engineers and Architects for his research work. I'd like to welcome Mr. Thakkar.
We're nearly in the afternoon mode. It's a little difficult to stand behind the podium, so I thought let me just come a little bit in the front. It's easier to walk so you don't fall asleep, while giving a presentation. So just a little addition to the introduction, what was there. Some of the books that I've largely basically written and published are co-authored. So my 3 books are largely co-authored. One of them, which is Matra, is with Sky. She's sitting over here. Another one, which is Pratha, is with Bharat. He's no more, and Mansi. So just wanted to make sure, there's enough information given out. What I'm going to largely talk about is the relevance of craft within the design education. One of the reasons to put this image over here is to really signify that it's Nar-Nari, and they both are together, Shiv-Parvati, and craft and design both are to be seen within those light, that they're always together and they keep on interchanging the role. And specifically in today's time, it has become extremely fluid, where they keep on changing the role. Hence, Shiv becomes Parvati, Parvati becomes Shiv. Now, when I'm going to go further, I generally use, within my basically teaching practice, a lot of analogies, and analogies are largely with either cooking or with film. I'm going to not use basically food right now because I don't think so that will be very good at this point. So let me do with the idea of film. So I'll start with a story at this point. Now, when you really look at the idea of craft and design, as Kaiwan was trying to say, that they're like cousins, brothers, and that's how people generally treat them. I say, let me a little bit more elaborate. They're more like friends, They're like young friends, and that's how they've largely basically grown up. And then they grow up to be a very close buddies, and you cannot basically separate them. So when you think about both of them together, when you think about Sholay, it's like similarly, you think about Jay and Viru both together, and that's how we largely see craft and design. And that's how, within the Indian scenario, craft and design was seen and perceived. So the craftspeople used to make things, would design things. So major of the vernacular traditional architecture within the Indian context are being done by master builders. There were no architects, there were no designers. And that's how the shift used to happen. So there was no, basically, a kind of a strong boundary which was between them. If you kind of little elaborate, that craft is largely more rooted in culture. It's part of intangible heritage. And it had a more reverence with time. It is slow, it takes time. It is like making a let's say more like a matla ondiyu, where you basically cook it and it savors over the period of time. I know you're hungry, but I'll still do that, right? Design is fast track, right? Design loves trend. Design wants to move ahead. It's largely rooted in future. It has more practices which is based at this point. And then what happens in the story? There comes time. Basanti, right? And Basanti basically starts controlling everything. So the design starts running ahead with time, and the crafts is a little bit more rooted in past, and it holds itself at that point. Till this point, it was okay because there was no major shift or drift which was happening. But then comes industrialization. You know, that's when things happen. This is when basically post-independence, you know, the Swadeshi movement goes off, the modern movement largely basically puts in. I don't know what would have happened if Gandhiji would have been still alive. You know, a lot of things basically largely change. But there was an emergence. So within the Congress, they started looking at idea of bringing 12-year plan, trying to save idea of crafts. So there was an emergence of handmade. So if you still look at the basically those papers, it is talking about policies, but it was more of a let's try and save it. You know, it's not let's try and evolve it, but didn't work. You know. So industrialization captured time, and there goes Thakkar. Okay, there goes the handmade, and this is what happened. Oh, and then suddenly people started realizing that a lot of things which are within our culture are slowly going away. You know, let's try and basically bring them. Let's try and revive them. From 1960s to nearly basically 2000, 1990. People started coming together and says, let's try and revive what is happening at this point, you know. So they started looking at crafts and trying to basically put multiple policies. There were a huge number of people started working towards it at this point, but they were a little late. And there goes the crafts. You meet a lot of people within the craft industry, a lot of earlier set of generations, and they all say craft is a sunset industry. You meet a lot of IS officers, DCH, you know, everybody. And you start wondering, is it really so? No, I don't think so, you know. So what's something which is die? It has to grow. Now that's the reason why I've put that little coin at the point, you know. Now that's the best part of it, how you see it. Somebody's trying to basically do that. So it's now the time. And that's what I keep on telling my students and people around it. It's never too late, you know. It has not died yet, you know. Let's not look at it. There are multiple ways to do it. Let's revive, reinvent, recreate, recraft, decraft, whatever you want to say. It is still part of us. It is still part of our system at this point. So coming to a little facts and figures and how we can basically go ahead and take this forward. So crafts have been largely known with multiple set of words from industrial art, traditional craft, handicraft, heritage crafts, studio, contemporary, building crafts, new emerging terms, neo-craft, digital, hybrid, you know, new vernacular, urban crafts. In a lot of ways, people are now re-looking at it, reinterpreting the entire scenario at this point, right? Whichever way, let's not define it. You know, the moment you start defining it, you're trying to box it. So let's not move into the process of defining it. Let's start the process of integrating it. So if you really look at craft and design, they both are largely a part of creative industries. And I've started liking this term because UK largely turned out this term, creative industries. And if you read that, it says those industries which have their origin in individual creativity, skills, and talent, and which have the potential for wealth and job creation through the generation and exploitation of intellectual property. This term was then further taken by UNESCO and given a much more larger set of an umbrella and put down into cultural and creative industries, CCI. Largely, 11 sectors, 5 global regions, if you start looking at it. And they started defining the sectors of activity whose principal purpose is the production, reproduction, promotion, distribution, and or commercialization of goods, services, and activities of cultural, artistic, or heritage-related nature. You know? So this is where architecture and visual arts, basically, this is where the arts, craft, design largely basically falls into place. Giving a little more detail about figures. If you look at the CCI's 2015 report at this point, Asia Pacific, that's where we are largely, and it has 743 billion, dollars of revenue and 12.7 million job. Now this is 2015. Do you understand this? Look at the potential that we are looking at within a larger global framework of looking at craft, design, culture, all coming together within this. And in some sense, we have been discussing that. People within this platform or dais have been talking about all three. And yesterday, Geeta was talking about the idea of liberal arts and how trying to bring all of them together at this point. took out some of the numbers from Craft Council of India census, which says we have a population of 3 crore craftspeople within India. That's a resource, that's an asset that we have at this point, and that's a map we largely made just to visualize where does it fit. Now, looking at the craft, I was trying to figure out what is happening with the design education, So now where do you get this design education data? So one was Council of Architecture. So we said, let's look at what is the Council of Architecture data. That's the status of intake, which is August, just a very recent report, which says there are around 25,000 intake of basically architecture students within the school. And I said that's little lesser number with the amount of things which are growing with basically, people having intake of 40, 50, 60, 80, 90, and people now moving towards 120. I thought this is not such a very right figure, but I thought let me compare both of them. Looking at the craft population and the current intake within the states at this point, and trying to see what are the kind of correlations, what is happening. One of the reasons to do this at this point is because there are a huge number of design schools which are largely emerging. We are talking about pedagogy, we are talking about course curriculum at this point, but all of them are talking about standardization at this point. They're looking at West, they're taking the structure which are largely within the West. They're looking at the idea of school in Bombay cannot offer the same set of education. I don't think so that's right at this point. So started looking at some of the dots where, like West Bengal, huge number of crafts, barely any student intake. Similarly, Andhra Pradesh, these are the places where there is a rich plethora of cultural knowledge which is existing at this point. So I started going a little further and started doing a little more research and looked at the MHRD report, because now that a lot of things are happening, MHRD is largely planning to take over a lot of stuff. So this is a very recent report. And not only looking at design, but also looking at design, architecture, and art, because all three are combined, related, connected at this point. It says 20,000 in design, 80,000 in architecture, and 95 lakh in the art courses. Now that's a huge number that we are looking at. So we are looking at education across all of them. Idea of basically bringing all of them together. And huge number of female ratio at this point. Idea of gender. How do you bring the idea of gender within the design education? These are larger issues that one should basically take in cognizance while developing the idea of curriculum at this point. So what is the need of today's time? When we really talk about the idea of curriculum and vis-a-vis in reference with, basically I was talking about craft. I was trying to broaden and expand the definition of craft, and we say, let's call it more like a regional knowledge. So when you really look at the design education, it is largely combining it with regional knowledge and the emerging technology. We talked about digitizations, Rhino, multiple models, augmented reality, all are part of today's world, and that has to become, a kind of a cohesive model to look at this. Generally then looking at design curriculum, and it can be broken down into larger 4 categories. This is very broad framework, So largely we have a studio, we have courses, we have thesis, and we have a training. And then we have an extra design curricular activities, which is also equally important part. Taking it further, within the so-called design studio, it's basically can be further classified. This is not a kind of clear-cut definitions, but somewhere around it, where it's trying to say it is responsive to site, it becomes project-based. We talked about residential, commercial, adaptive use. It basically moves towards that. Issue-based, idea of sustainability, climate change responses, or idea-based, conceptual, imagination-based, fantasy-based. And same with theory, courses largely within history, technology, practice, falls within that framework. Your workshops, either they're technology-based or they're material-based. Your training module, which becomes one of the very important segment within the set of learning at this point, and that's where possibly Triple ID can play a very critical role, because that is where the practice and education will come together when students are within the design education framework. And then comes the thesis, which is largely either theoretical or applied, and then multiple set of extracurricular activities. It can still go on from field study to electives, workshops, symposiums, where the learning largely happens. when I was trying to do this, I thought, how does really basically craft and culture really come within this? So instead of saying that it comes within the studio practice, it comes within that, because they are connected across all subjects, all courses, all disciplines, and hence, instead of looking at that, I said, let's look at the actions of learning in some sense, which are where we can basically have a dialogue with the crafts and culture at this point. So these are a couple of set of actions that we have basically pinned down, and I thought, let me just kind of go a little bit over. So these actions are connected to multiple set of broader segment, whether within the studio, whether within the training thesis, at this point. And that is what we need to basically start looking at it, because this is where the actual dialogue with culture, with regional knowledge is going to happen. So let's look at identify. Now that's something which is an interesting thing. Can somebody tell me basically how do you find craftspeople? Any of you guys are basically doing a project, There are a huge number of people who basically tell us that I'm working on this project, I'm looking for a textile artisan, I'm looking for this, I'm looking for that, And so how do you find them? Designers have LinkedIn, Facebook, core, multiple ways to basically go about it. Karigars generally don't have those things, and that is one of the very important aspect, is to start and find those set of karigars. Now, there was one of the data which was floating across many presentations which I've seen by a huge number of people associated to craft, and it says there are around 78 lakh karigars in India, which is by the census which was there. So I met this IS officer in DCH in Delhi, and I told him, is this number really correct? Have you seen this data? And he says, of course, I've seen the data. I said, how would I take it? Arey, RTI file kar do yaar. Now that's a national data. That's a resource data, right? And they say, no. So there's no number. There's nothing. So this is where you start basically doing your first step. Within design education, try and basically send students. So we send students onto the field and says, go and find karigars. They say, how? You figure it out. How? And that's when basically, because they start identifying the region, what is there within the region, idea of history comes in, idea of geography comes in, culture comes in, they start doing a research, they go in this area and says, mujhe karigar chahiye, jo lakde mein kaam karta hai, metal mein kaam karta hai. And then they slowly start finding out people within that region, and you start identifying. At the research center which I head, we have actually made a kind of a mapping tool. So it's a mobile app. So my team basically goes in and we have identified more than around 1,200 artisans, within that context. We actually basically, so we're trying to build up also something called a LinkedIn come Behance for the basically karigars, because how would you even know the karigars? You will need to know their background. What do they work in? And that's a method of actually basically bringing craft and design together. Expose. We talked about basically field work. So yesterday Sky talked about field work, to do the idea of field notes. We're talking about basically sending people to the field. She talked about the idea of metro and how basically bringing the field, and that is important. You expose, that's one of the knowledge which is extremely important. Nothing is classroom, right? The tacit knowledge, it only happens basically when you send kids over there. They start learning what it is. They start respecting idea of what is rural, semi-urban. They work with different environments. So from sending them to craft clusters, heritage sites, emergent technology industries, contemporary design projects, that's where they start learning, and that's where the association starts happening with culture and crafts. Interact. One of the things that we have seen is, we are talking about faculty over here, the training of faculty members. How do you do that? There's a kind of things which says there are a lot of young faculty members who are there. They don't have a body of knowledge which is there. We have a whole plethora of karigars, 19th generation of knowledge, empirical knowledge, 50 years of practice, 40 years of practice. Why don't we bring them on board at this point? There are people, who actually can bring that body of knowledge. Now, one of the very interesting things which we were discussing between me and Rishabh is that when Professor Chen was giving the presentation, you looked at it, and except the language, when you look at the drawings and everything, everybody nearly sitting in the room would understand what it is. So drawing was an extremely powerful medium. In same way, crafts is largely about making. So a lot of time you don't need a language or method of communication. The ways in which the knowledge can be transferred at this point. Hence, it's important to bring them people on board within the so-called university framework or structure at this point. Record. So yesterday Kavan was saying that when somebody's talking about research, it only basically boils down to idea of documentation, and recording. I feel in India, whether like it or not, we first need that, before we even move to a second step of it. You look at Europe and everything nearly is recorded. In India, tell me, because major of them is intangible heritage. There's a time, there's a need. If you're looking at, there are basically more than 600 design institutes within India. Let's look at it. Record the knowledge which is around them. That becomes a body of knowledge. He was talking about history of interior design at this point, and they say there's not enough data about it. We need to start collecting from the data which is around it, start making it a more larger, holistic body of knowledge, which is then shared with everybody at that point. And that is how we will generate, resources for the design curriculum. Investigate. Go further and deeper into it. That's your first set is basically just that. The second set is start basically getting into the process of investigation. Why? Why did they do this? What materials? How did they go about it? How did the history of the crafts basically came in? What is the culture which was there? And then connect it back to the design issues. The interesting part, the guy who's sitting there is Ramesh. Ramesh's work is currently in Jawaharlal Kala Kendra. We worked with him, and it was quite nice to see gallery number 3. So we worked in Bapugao with him. And he's a Worli painter. He's trying to develop a Worli center. We are trying to help him to do that in Bapugao at this point. And it's great to see basically his work also on the same platform, he and his wife over here at this point. So we have a kind of a romantic notions about crafts that they are there. They are here with us. These are the people who are there, possibly. He has traveled more the world than possibly a lot of people sitting in this room at this point. Analyze. One of the which basically is critically important, and what largely basically also Prem was talking about, critic is very important. And this is where the idea of design and crafts and what comes in between, or design and practice, and what comes is basically critical analysis and back and forth. Crafts are largely rooted in time. They go in the method of the same format. Question it, analyze it. What can be used, what cannot be used. Not everything is good within that framework, right? So it cannot be a notion that everything is good, let's bring them on. Bring and pick what is important. Try and basically look at it more diagnostically and then take it on board. Collaboration. One of the very key aspect of today's time. People are talking about co-creation. People are talking about co-working. There are a lot of spaces emerging. There are a lot of methods emerging. Dean was talking about basically bringing nearly 8 architects together, collaborating, right? And that's what is important. You collaborate with the people who have a body of knowledge which is there, and then largely work within that. So yesterday when people largely talk that there's nothing really happening within this field, I kind of beg to differ, because yesterday Kavan was saying that there's not people who are not really collaborating and bringing. There are degrees and models of collaboration, and what really comes out. Every time it is not a product, it is also a sharing of knowledge, learning which is there as a part of it. Ideate. Bring those ideas on board. Karigars have a tacit knowledge. They don't know possibly a formal design process. You sit with them, they work with them. Actually, the amount of knowledge which they can basically, they have material knowledge, they can bring on board, they create. We have done multiple workshops with designers, architects, students, civil engineers, along with Karigars, and the kind of ideas that largely come on board. People have ability to think, they have an ability to make, bring them on board. That's what happens when you bring people like this together. Create. Make things together, right? See, one of the reasons these actions are important is because this can happen across the courses, across the studios, across the discipline, and then bring everybody together. It's the idea of synergy which is extremely important in today's time, when talking about it. Yesterday, Geeta was talking about the culture of an institution. This is the culture of the institution that we are largely talking about. Bringing everybody together on the same board, on the same platform, removing the basically pyramidal hierarchies, bring flat hierarchies. Everybody has something to offer at this point. Once you do this, evaluate, because that's something which is very important to do that. What you're producing, and hence the issue of climate change, environment, sustainability. You evaluate what you're developing, what are the kind of impacts within the today's world, and how it is going to affect the society. Important scenario. Everybody sitting in this room have been working and they have their own practices, and people somehow have started guarding their own set of practices. When we generally go and work with the crafts field, one of the things that we have realized is that they have never told us no for sharing the knowledge. At this point, you go and sit with the Karigar and they would have a knowledge of 3 generations and they'll sit with you. They'll share everything with you. You go to a design practice and they say, oh no, IP rights, copyrights, please send us an email. Oh, we will not tell you. Oh, this is, the client will not like it. Right? There's a great, basically, bounding of let's not share it. This is mine, this is mine. For a Karigar, it is generations and they share the knowledge. It is important to move towards it. We have moved towards basically Creative Commons. So all the data, everything that we work, we actually put it up online. We want people to have it, right? And hence the idea of dissemination is extremely important. If you want to develop a larger set of body of design resources at this point, you bring this knowledge on board. Bring it onto a platform where everybody shares, and that is where a larger, basically, let's say, knowledge body will be made. And that's where when basically he talks about there's not enough knowledge on history of interior design, this is where it is going to come. He was showing the basically boxes, ivory boxes, those are made by people. You bring this on platform, and that's where people will start having a dialogue, Now, when we also talk about dissemination, we bring multiple platforms, from exhibitions to cultural programs. We bring Karigars on the board, on the dais, and they share, right? And hence, that is how you share and disseminate the data at this point. Connect. At this point, I would also like to thank IIID, because IIID has been extremely helpful in supporting many of our educational programs with craftspeople. And that's one of the areas where basically we had done one of the fellowship with some of the crafts in Kutch, and they got all the certificates, they became part of it. And this is where the role of such body will also play very important, in order to bring this up forefront to the people. Now, these are the set of actions, and I thought, let me just look at the kind of outputs, what basically may come out. It's a very brief overview, it's not a detailed overview, but just to have a little more glimpse towards it, because I thought actions, and we are talking about learning outcomes, and this is where the outputs basically start coming into picture. Drawings, one of the very important means and mediums of doing that, because that's how largely architects and designers use them, learn them. That becomes a resource body. We have started documenting some of the traditional vernacular architecture. We have basically recorded them from architecture till the last possible detail. At this point, I can basically boast that the kind of drawings that we have created, nobody within the South Asia within the last couple of decades would have created that. That's a body of knowledge that we are doing it. And everything currently is basically online for people to share, And because this is how we will decode something. This is how we will basically have the knowledge. Publications, multiple set of publications. So yesterday when Kaiwan was saying there's not enough publication which is related to that, sorry. Wrong. Let's please bring do your data, do your research. There are a huge number of publications which are related to design, craft, history, and CEPT has been largely forefront. SID has been forefront. We have published more than 22 books related to that. Look at it. When you basically do things, bring it on board. Bring it out on the platform at this point. Now, whenever we do any of the projects, one of the things that we have started doing is developing models, tools. She's walking, so which means I need to hurry up. Okay, so that's the innovation tools, right? You are not seeing me, sorry, right? Installations, working with Karigars. That's the Bapugaon. That's the installation that we have done at this point. That's in Gundyali, that's in IIM. Do multiple scale stuff. Projects, students' projects, working with craftspeople, working with Karigars. Prototypes, and this is where I was remembering Prem, one of the slides which was in the Prem when this Karigar was, one of the person was sitting and looking at the horizon. This is a group of people who have never built a boat. They've never worked bamboo, cane, coir, anything. They've worked with it. This is the first time they are basically putting it in the water and trying and testing it out. Look at the kind of idea of joy. Maybe this is partly what Prem was talking about, at this point, participatory consciousness. Maybe, I'm not wrong, right, possibly. But that's what it is, this is what largely comes out of it. Graphics, multiple manners of communication. We have got nearly 36 narrative crafts within India. Why does our design books look so boring at this point? Why can't we bring them on board to help us, right? Tara books, Kaiwan was saying, one of the good example of bringing them on board at this point. So the story continues. That's it. 3 more slides. 3 more slides. You can count till 20, right? 3 more slides. So who's going to be the new protagonist at this point? Who's going to take this forward? Who are we? Are we going to take this forward? Is it going to be a collective effort, right? Who are the Jay and Vidu of today's time? Is it them? At this point, are they going to go alone? Are they going to go together? I think we all are at this point, who have to take both the regional knowledge, the technology, design,